The knocking started every night at 2:13 a.m. The first time I heard someone knock on my door at 2:13 in the morning, I assumed it was a mistake. I didn't think it was strange. I didn't think I was in danger. Honestly, I barely even remembered it happening the next morning. I lived alone in a small house on the edge of town, and random noises were pretty normal. The house was older, the floors creaked, the pipes made strange sounds, and the neighborhood was quiet enough that I could hear things happening outside that most people probably wouldn't notice. At the time, I had been living there for a little over a year. It wasn't my dream home or anything like that. I bought it because it was affordable, it had a decent amount of space, and it was far enough away from the city that I didn't have to deal with constant traffic and noise. The downside was that there weren't many houses nearby. My closest neighbor was about half a mile away. The road I lived on was mostly older houses surrounded by trees. During the day, I actually liked that. It was peaceful. At night, though, it could feel almost too quiet, especially when you were the only person inside. My routine was pretty simple. I worked a normal job during the week, came home, cooked dinner, watched TV, and usually went to bed around midnight. I wasn't someone who stayed up late often, but one night I couldn't sleep. I remember lying in bed, scrolling through my phone when I heard it. 3 knocks. Not loud, not aggressive, just 3 quick taps against my front door. At first, I didn't move. I just stared at the ceiling. My first thought was that maybe I had imagined it. The house was old. Things shifted. The wind could make noises that sounded like something else. A few seconds passed. Then I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time I sat up. I looked at the clock on my nightstand. 2:13 a.m. I remember that specifically because I thought it was such an odd time for someone to be at my door. My first assumption was that maybe someone had the wrong house. It happened occasionally. Delivery drivers, neighbors, someone looking for an address nearby. Nothing serious. I got out of bed and walked toward the hallway. As I got closer to the front door, I realized something. The person outside wasn't saying anything. Usually, if someone accidentally came to your house in the middle of the night, they would call out. They would say your name. They would apologize. They would explain why they were there. But whoever was outside was completely silent. I stood about 10 feet away from the door, listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No movement. I thought about looking through the window beside the door, but something stopped me. I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't fear exactly. It was just a feeling that I shouldn't. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds before finally walking back to my bedroom. I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe someone was drunk. Maybe a kid was messing around. Maybe someone knocked and immediately left. The next morning, I actually forgot about it. That changed a few days later, because it happened again, at the same time. Same 3 knocks. 2:13 a.m. This time, I was awake when it happened. I had been watching TV in bed when I heard it. The second I heard the first knock, I checked the clock. 2:13. My stomach dropped slightly. Not because I thought something terrible was happening. Mostly because it was strange. A coincidence. That was what I told myself. A coincidence. I waited. Again, nothing. No voice. No footsteps. No car driving away. I eventually got up and checked the front window. The driveway was empty. The street was empty. There wasn't even anyone walking nearby. I went back to bed, but this time I couldn't stop thinking about it. The first night could have been anything. The second night felt different. The problem was I had no idea what I was supposed to do about it. I couldn't call the police and say someone knocked on my door twice. Nothing illegal had happened. Nobody threatened me. Nobody tried to get inside. It was just weird. And weird isn't really something you can report. For the next week, it kept happening. Not every night. That would have almost been easier. It happened every few days. Always at 2:13 a.m. Always 3 knocks. Always silence afterward. I started changing my routine. I stopped watching TV in my bedroom. I started going to sleep earlier. I kept my phone beside me. I checked the locks more than once before bed. I knew I was probably overreacting, but there was something unsettling about the consistency. Random things don't usually happen at exactly the same time. Eventually, I decided to install a camera. I bought a cheap outdoor security camera and placed it above my front door. The entire time I was setting it up, I felt ridiculous. I kept telling myself I was turning a harmless situation into something bigger than it was. But I wanted proof. Either proof that someone was actually coming to my door, or proof that I was imagining things. The first night after installing the camera, I stayed awake. I didn't want to admit it, but I was waiting. I had my phone open with the camera app running. Around 2 a.m., I started feeling stupid. I was sitting in my bed, staring at my phone like I was waiting for something supernatural to happen. Then the notification appeared. Motion detected. My entire body went still. I opened the camera. The video loaded, and there was someone standing at my front door. I couldn't see their face. The camera angle only showed their upper body and part of the porch. They were wearing a dark jacket. They weren't moving. They were just standing there, looking at the door. I watched for several seconds. Then they raised their hand. 3 knocks. My heart started beating faster, because now I knew. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was actually coming to my house. At exactly 2:13 a.m., I watched the person stand there afterward, waiting for what felt like forever. Then they slowly turned around and walked away. I immediately opened the live view. I wanted to see where they went. But by the time the camera switched over, they were gone. I checked the recording. The person had only been there for about 20 seconds. That was it. 20 seconds. They came to my door, knocked, waited, left. I spent the rest of the night looking through the footage, trying to find anything useful. A face, a license plate, anything. But the person had clearly positioned themselves in a way that made identifying them almost impossible. The next morning, I called the non-emergency police line. I explained everything. The officer I spoke with was polite. He asked if the person tried to enter. I said no. He asked if they threatened me. I said no. He asked if they damaged anything. Again, no. He told me to keep documenting it and call back if anything escalated. I understood. There wasn't much they could do, but hearing that didn't make me feel better, because after I hung up, I realized something. The person on the camera wasn't trying to get my attention. They weren't trying to scare me away. They weren't knocking and running. They were waiting, and I couldn't stop thinking about one question. Why? Why come to my house every few nights at exactly the same time, just to knock? For the next 2 weeks, I changed everything. I parked my car in a different spot. I kept the outside lights on. I stopped leaving curtains open. I even started sleeping in the guest room because it was on the other side of the house. The knocks continued, but something changed. The person started staying longer. At first, they stood there for 20 seconds, then 30, then almost a full minute. It felt like they were waiting for something. One night, I watched the camera live as they approached my door. I already knew what was coming. 2:13 a.m. The person stepped on my porch, raised their hand, knocked 3 times. Then instead of leaving, they sat down on my front steps and stayed there. I stared at my phone, completely frozen, because for the first time since this started, I realized something. They weren't coming to knock. The knocking was just how they were letting me know they were there. The next few days were the first time I genuinely started feeling like I was living with someone I didn't know. Before that, I had been trying to convince myself that Ryan was just socially awkward. Maybe he had strange habits. Maybe he was overly concerned. Maybe he simply didn't understand what was normal when sharing an apartment with someone. But after finding the broken tape on my door, I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. I started paying attention to everything. The little things I had ignored before suddenly felt important. I noticed that Ryan always seemed to be in the apartment whenever I came home. Not every single time, but enough that it started bothering me. If I left work early, he was there. If I came home late, he was usually sitting in the living room. If I mentioned that I was going somewhere, he would casually ask questions. Nothing that sounded suspicious by itself. Just small questions. Who are you meeting? How long are you going to be out? Are you driving or taking an Uber? At first, I answered because I thought that was just normal roommate conversation. But eventually I realized something. I never asked him those questions. I didn't care where he went. I didn't need to know, but he always seemed interested in where I was. One Friday night, I decided to test something. I told him I was going out with co-workers after work. That wasn't unusual. I had mentioned co-workers before, and I knew he had heard me talk about them. But instead of actually going out, I went to a friend's apartment across town. I didn't tell Ryan. I didn't post anything online. I just wanted to see if anything changed. Around 10 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was a message from Ryan. Everything okay? I stared at the screen for a few seconds. I thought maybe he was just being friendly. So I replied, "Yeah, why?" His response came a few minutes later. He sent another message. Saw the... Didn't mean anything by it. Just checking. I put my phone down and tried not to overthink it. But that night, I barely slept. The next morning, I made an excuse to stop by the apartment while Ryan was gone. I told my friend I needed to grab something. When I walked inside, everything looked normal. Too normal. The apartment was quiet. Ryan's bedroom door was closed. The kitchen was clean. Nothing seemed out of place. But then I noticed something. My bedroom door. It was open. I stood there staring at it. I knew I had locked it before leaving. Not just closed it. Locked it. You walked over slowly. My hand was shaking slightly as I turned the handle. The door opened. Inside, everything looked mostly the same. But then I noticed my closet. One of the doors was slightly open. I always kept it closed. I walked over and looked inside. Nothing. Just clothes and boxes. I almost convinced myself I was being paranoid. Until I noticed something sitting on the floor. A small notebook. It wasn't mine. I picked it up. For a second, I thought maybe it belonged to Ryan. Maybe he had accidentally left it in my room. But when I opened it, I immediately felt sick. The pages weren't random notes. They were lists, dates, times, little observations. The first page had my name written at the top. Underneath, it were things like leaves around 7:40 most mornings. Usually home between 5:30 and 6. Calls sister every Sunday. Likes watching shows late at night. I flipped through more pages. There were dozens of entries. Some were about things I had never told him. Things he couldn't have known unless he was watching me. My stomach dropped. I put the notebook down immediately. I didn't even think about taking pictures. I didn't think about confronting him. My only thought was that I needed to leave. I grabbed my bag and walked out. I went straight back to my friend's place and called my landlord. I didn't explain everything at first. I just said there was a safety issue and I needed to discuss ending the lease. The landlord sounded annoyed. He told me roommates had disagreements all the time. He said unless Ryan was damaging property or breaking the lease, there wasn't much he could do. That answer scared me more than I expected, because I realized I was on my own. I had no proof that Ryan had done anything illegal. He hadn't threatened me. He hadn't stolen anything. He had just been watching me. And somehow, that felt worse. I stayed at my friend's apartment for 3 nights. During that time, I barely slept. Every time my phone buzzed, I thought it was Ryan. Eventually, I knew I had to go back. I couldn't avoid my own apartment forever. So I decided I was going to confront him. But before I did, I made sure I wasn't alone. I had a friend waiting outside in their car. I walked into the apartment and immediately noticed Ryan was home. He was sitting on the couch watching TV. He looked over and smiled. "Hey, where have you been?" I remember how normal he sounded. That was the strangest part. Like nothing had happened. I stood there holding the notebook. I asked him one question. "Why were you writing about me?" The smile disappeared. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Then he looked at the notebook, and instead of denying it, he sighed. "I knew you would find that eventually." That sentence is something I still think about, because it meant he knew what he was doing. He knew it was wrong. He just didn't think I would catch him. I asked him why. Why he was entering my room. Why he was keeping notes. Why he was tracking my schedule. His answer was something I never expected. He said, "I was trying to understand you." I told him that wasn't normal. He looked genuinely confused. "No, you don't understand. I wasn't trying to hurt you." I asked him what he was trying to do. He didn't answer. Instead, he asked me something. "Do you remember when we first met?" I said yes. Then he said, "You didn't remember me." I didn't understand what he meant. He told me that we had actually met before, years earlier, at a previous job, a place I had only worked at for a few months. I had completely forgotten about him, but apparently, he remembered me. That was when I realized something. Ryan hadn't just found a roommate listing. He had been looking for me. I left the apartment that day and never stayed there again. My friend helped me move my things out while Ryan was at work. I never got a real explanation for everything. I don't know how long he had been watching me before becoming my roommate. I don't know why he chose me. The police were contacted, but because he hadn't physically harmed me and there wasn't enough evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do. The only thing that came from it was that I was able to break my lease. I moved to another apartment several months later. I changed my routines. I stopped sharing personal information with people I barely knew, and I became much more careful about who I allowed into my life. The part that still bothers me isn't that Ryan was strange. It's that for almost 2 months, I convinced myself I was imagining things. I ignored every warning sign because I wanted to believe I had simply found a good roommate. But sometimes the people who make you uncomfortable are the people you should be paying the most attention to. Because the scariest part about living with someone like Ryan is that nothing seems wrong at first. They don't look dangerous. They don't act dangerous. They just slowly become part of your life. And by the time you realize something is wrong, they already know almost everything about you. Next story. The first sign that something was wrong was when I found a second toothbrush in my bathroom. At the time, I didn't immediately think someone was living in my house. That sounds ridiculous looking back, but when something strange happens in your own home, your brain usually searches for every possible explanation before accepting the one you don't want to believe. I had owned my house for almost 3 years before this happened. It was a small, older home on the edge of town. Nothing special. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a small kitchen, and a spare bedroom that I mostly used for storage. I bought it because it was affordable, and honestly, I liked the fact that it was quiet. I had lived in apartments for years before that, and I was tired of hearing neighbors through the walls. I liked coming home and knowing it was completely my own space. The spare bedroom was basically forgotten. When I first moved in, I had plans for it. I thought maybe I would turn it into an office, maybe a workout room, maybe a guest room. But over time, it just became the place where I put things I didn't know what to do with. Old clothes, boxes, holiday decorations, furniture I wasn't ready to get rid of. I barely opened the door. Most of the time, I forgot it was even there. The first few years were completely normal. Nothing unusual happened. I went to work, came home, cooked dinner, and spent most nights watching TV or playing video games. I wasn't someone who had people over often. I was pretty private. The only person who regularly came by was my sister. She lived about 20 minutes away and would occasionally stop by on weekends. Other than that, nobody really had a reason to be inside my house, which is why the toothbrush bothered me. It happened on a Monday morning. I was getting ready for work when I noticed it. My bathroom was small, so I kept everything on a little shelf above the sink. My toothbrush, toothpaste, shaving supplies, nothing complicated. But sitting beside my toothbrush was another one, a plain white toothbrush. I stared at it for a few seconds. I honestly thought my sister had left it there. That was the only explanation that made sense. Maybe she had stayed over and forgot it. I picked it up and looked at it. It wasn't new. The bristles were slightly bent. It looked like someone had actually been using it. I sent my sister a message. "Did you leave a toothbrush here?" She replied a few minutes later. "No." I looked back at the toothbrush. I remember feeling confused more than scared. I figured maybe she forgot. Maybe she didn't remember. So I threw it away and went to work. I didn't think about it again until I came home. When I walked through the front door, something immediately felt different. Not obviously different. Nothing was moved. Nothing was broken. But I had that strange feeling that someone had been there. I stood in the doorway for a few seconds. The house was completely silent. I checked every room. Everything looked normal. I told myself I was just being paranoid because of the toothbrush. That night, I slept normally. The next strange thing happened about a week later. I noticed food missing. Specifically, food I knew I hadn't eaten. I had bought a package of granola bars over the weekend. There were 6 inside. I ate one, then put them in the cabinet. A few days later, I opened the cabinet and there were only 2 left. At first, I assumed I had forgotten. That was the explanation I wanted to believe. Maybe I ate more than I remembered. Maybe I brought some to work. But I knew I hadn't. I started paying closer attention. Over the next few weeks, little things started happening. The thermostat would be set differently. A kitchen drawer I always kept closed would be slightly open. The bathroom mirror would have water spots on it. Small things. Things that were easy to ignore individually. But when you put them together, they started creating a pattern. The worst part was that I didn't know if I was imagining it. Because nobody wants to believe a stranger is entering their home. Your house is supposed to be the one place where you feel completely safe. The place where you don't have to think about who's watching. So your brain fights against that possibility. One Friday night, I decided to test something. I left a small piece of paper behind my front door before going to work. I placed it in a way that if the door opened, it would fall. It was a simple test. I felt stupid doing it, like I was investigating my own house. But I needed to know. When I came home that evening, the paper was still there. For a moment, I felt relieved. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe there was a normal explanation. Then I noticed something. The back door. It wasn't fully closed. It was open just slightly. I knew I'd locked it. I always locked it. I walked toward it slowly. My first thought was that someone had broken in. I checked the entire house. Closets, bathrooms, the basement. Nothing. Nobody was there. But when I got to the spare bedroom, I stopped. The door was open. I knew I closed it. I always kept it closed because I didn't use the room. I stood there looking inside. At first, everything seemed normal. Boxes, old furniture, random storage. Then I noticed something. One of my boxes had been moved. Not opened. Not damaged. Just moved. It was sitting a few feet away from where I remembered leaving it. I walked closer. Behind the boxes was a small gap between the wall and an old bookshelf. I had never paid attention to it before, but now I noticed something. There was a blanket, folded neatly, sitting on the floor. I froze, because that wasn't something I owned. I didn't keep blankets in that room. I slowly moved the boxes aside, and that's when I saw it. Someone had made a small space behind the furniture. There was a pillow, bottled water, food wrappers, a flashlight, a phone charger. For several seconds, I just stood there trying to understand what I was looking at. Someone had been inside my house. Not just once. Someone had been staying there, living there, and I had no idea. I immediately backed away from the room. I grabbed my phone and called the police. While I waited outside, I kept looking at my house. The windows, the doors, everything looked completely normal. That was the part that scared me the most. Nothing about the house looked like someone had been hiding inside, but someone had. And suddenly I started wondering how long they had been there, and what they had been doing while I was asleep. The first time I noticed something strange inside my house, I convinced myself it was nothing. That was the easiest explanation. I had owned my home for almost 4 years, and in that time, nothing unusual had ever happened. It was a small, older house on the edge of town. Not the kind of place you see in movies. There was no creepy history. No abandoned no extraños neighbors. It was just a normal house that I bought because it was affordable and quiet. After years of living in apartments, I wanted somewhere I could finally have my own space. No neighbors above me. No footsteps through the walls. No random people making noise at all hours of the night. Just me, my house, and my routine. And for a long time, that's exactly what it was. I worked a regular job during the week. I usually left around 7:30 in the morning and came home sometime between 5 and 6. Most nights were quiet. I cooked dinner, watched TV, and went to bed. I wasn't someone who had people over often. My friends lived across town, and my family only visited occasionally. The only person who came by regularly was my sister. She would stop over every couple of weeks to catch up. Other than that, nobody really had a reason to be inside my house. Which is why the first thing that happened bothered me. But it didn't scare me. Not at first. It started with a toothbrush. I remember it was a Monday morning. I was running late for work and was getting ready in the bathroom. My bathroom was small, so I kept everything organized on a shelf above the sink. My toothbrush, my toothpaste, my shaving supplies. Nothing complicated. But that morning, I noticed something sitting beside my toothbrush. A second toothbrush. I just stared at it. For a few seconds, my brain didn't even process what I was seeing. Then I picked it up. It was a plain white toothbrush. Not a new one. The bristles were slightly bent. It looked like someone had been using it. My first thought was my sister. That had to be it. Maybe she forgot it. Maybe she stayed over one night and I didn't remember. So I sent her a message. "Did you leave a toothbrush here?" A few minutes later, she replied, "No. What?" I looked back at the toothbrush. I remember laughing a little because it seemed so strange. I told myself she probably just forgot. Maybe she didn't remember. People forget small things all the time. So I threw it away and went to work. That should have been the end of it. But a few days later, something else happened. I noticed food missing from my kitchen. I bought a box of protein bars from the store. There were 8 inside. I ate one the first day. Then I put the box in the cabinet. About a week later, I opened the cabinet and noticed there were only 3 left. I stood there counting them. Then I checked the trash. Nothing. I checked my car. Nothing. I tried remembering if I had taken some at work, but I knew I hadn't. Again, I found an explanation. Maybe I forgot. Maybe I ate more than I thought. It was possible. And honestly, I wanted it to be possible, because the alternative was something I didn't want to consider. Over the next few weeks, more little things started happening. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would immediately make someone call the police. Just small things. Things that made me question my own memory. The thermostat would be lower than I left it. The kitchen cabinet doors would sometimes be slightly open. A glass would be sitting in the sink when I knew I had washed everything before going to bed. One night, I came home and noticed the bathroom mirror had water spots on it. That one bothered me, because I knew I hadn't used the bathroom before leaving. But again, I found myself making excuses. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I forgot. Maybe I was just noticing things that had always happened. That's the strange thing about situations like this. Your brain doesn't immediately jump to the worst possibility. It tries to protect you from it. It searches for normal explanations. Because believing that someone is entering your home without permission is terrifying. Your home is supposed to be the one place where you don't have to worry. The one place where you can completely relax. The thought that someone else might have access to it changes everything. A few weeks after the toothbrush incident, I decided to test something. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't mention it to my sister. I didn't tell my friends. I just wanted to know if I was imagining things. Before leaving for work, I placed a small piece of tape between my bedroom door and the frame. Nothing obvious, just enough that if someone opened the door, the tape would break. I felt ridiculous doing it. I remember thinking how paranoid I sounded, like I was investigating my own house. But when I left that morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. All day at work, I wondered if I was going to come home and feel stupid. I almost hoped I would. I wanted to find that tape still intact. I wanted proof that I was wrong. But when I pulled into my driveway that evening, I noticed something immediately. My front door was unlocked. I always locked it. Always. At first, I thought maybe I had forgotten. But as I walked inside, my stomach dropped. The tape on my bedroom door was broken. I stood there staring at it. I didn't move. I didn't touch the door. I just stared, because suddenly all the small things I had ignored didn't feel small anymore. Someone had been inside my room. Someone had opened my door. And there was only one explanation. Someone had access to my house. I immediately grabbed my phone and called my sister. I didn't even know how to explain what was happening. I just told her, I think someone has been coming into my house. She thought I was joking at first. Then she heard my voice. She told me to leave immediately and not stay there alone. I walked outside and sat in my car while I waited for her to arrive. I kept looking back at the house. The windows, the front door, the dark rooms. Everything looked completely normal. That was what bothered me. If someone broke in, you expect something to look wrong. A broken window, a damaged lock, something. But my house looked exactly the same. Like nothing had happened, except someone had been there. When my sister arrived, we went inside together. We checked every room, the bedrooms, the closets, the basement. Nothing. Nobody was there. For a moment, I felt embarrassed. I started thinking maybe I really had been imagining everything. Then we opened the spare bedroom, the room I barely used, the room where I kept boxes and old furniture. And that's when my sister noticed something. She pointed toward the back corner. Was that always there? I looked. At first, I didn't understand what she meant. Then I saw it. A blanket, folded neatly on the floor. I knew immediately. That wasn't mine. I didn't keep blankets in there. We moved some boxes out of the way. Behind an old bookshelf was a small hidden space. And inside that space were things that made my entire body go cold. A pillow, food wrappers, bottled water, a flashlight, a phone charger. Someone had created a place to sleep. Inside my house, the house I had been living in, the house I thought was completely private. My sister looked at me and whispered, "How long do you think they've been here?" And that was the question that terrified me, because I had no answer. I didn't know if someone had been hiding there for a few days, a few weeks, or something much longer. And the worst part was realizing something. While I was going about my normal life, going to work, cooking dinner, sleeping at night, Someone else had been inside my home, watching, waiting, and I had never noticed. Next story. The first note looked harmless. That was the part that bothered me the most later. Because when I found it, I didn't feel scared. I didn't feel threatened. I actually thought it was kind of funny. I remember walking out of my apartment one morning, coffee in hand, already thinking about how badly I wanted the weekend to arrive. It was a normal Tuesday. I had parked my car in the same spot I always did, near the back of the apartment parking lot. The building wasn't anything special. It was a small complex with maybe 40 units, mostly young professionals and older couples. It wasn't the kind of place where people really interacted with each other. Everyone mostly kept to themselves. You would see the same faces occasionally, but nobody really knew anyone. I had lived there for almost a year at that point, and I liked it because of that. I liked being anonymous. I liked coming home and not having talked to anyone. That morning, when I reached my car, I noticed a small piece of paper tucked underneath my windshield wiper. At first, I assumed it was an advertisement. That happens sometimes. Restaurants nearby would leave flyers on cars. I almost threw it away without reading it. But something made me stop. The paper wasn't printed. It was handwritten. It simply said, "Your headlights were left on yesterday. Hope you didn't get stuck." I stared at it for a few seconds. Then I laughed. I didn't even remember leaving my headlights on, but it was possible. Maybe someone in the apartment complex noticed. Maybe they were just trying to help. It was actually a nice gesture. I folded the note and put it in my car. I didn't think about it again. A few days later, there was another one. This time it said, "You always park in the same spot." That one felt slightly different. Not scary, just strange. I remember looking around the parking lot after reading it. There were only a few people outside. A man walking his dog. Someone loading groceries into their car. Nothing unusual. I convinced myself it was probably just someone making a harmless observation. Maybe one of my neighbors was joking. Maybe someone had a weird sense of humor. I threw the note away. But after that, they kept appearing. Not every day, just enough to make me notice. One note said, "You should lock your doors." Another said, "Your back tire looks low." Another simply said, "Bad day." The weird thing was that the notes weren't threatening. If anything, they sounded concerned, almost friendly. And that made it harder to decide how I should feel. Because if someone wrote something aggressive, I would immediately know something was wrong. But these notes were different. They made me question myself. Was I overreacting? Was someone just being kind? Or was someone paying way too much attention to me? The first time I became genuinely uncomfortable was when I realized they knew things they shouldn't. I had a habit of going to the gym after work, usually around 6 p.m. I didn't tell people about it. It wasn't something I posted online. It was just part of my routine. One evening, I came out to my car and found a note. It said, "Didn't see you at the gym today." I froze. I read it 3 times because suddenly the situation changed. Someone wasn't just noticing my car. Someone was noticing me. I immediately looked around the parking lot. Nothing. No one standing nearby. No one watching. Just parked cars and apartment buildings. I took the note inside and locked my door. That night, I kept thinking about it. The obvious question was, who was watching me? The next morning, I reported it to the apartment manager. I didn't make it sound dramatic. I just explained that someone had been leaving strange notes on my car and that I was starting to feel uncomfortable. The manager listened. Then she asked me something that I still think about. "Are you sure it's someone from the building?" I asked why she thought that. She told me something I didn't know. The parking lot wasn't completely private. There was a walking path behind the building that connected to a nearby neighborhood. Technically, anyone could walk through. That answer didn't make me feel better. It made me feel worse. Because now I realized it might not even be a neighbor. It could be anyone. For the next week, nothing happened. No notes. No strange messages. Nothing. Part of me felt relieved. I started thinking maybe whoever it was had realized they were making me uncomfortable. Maybe it was over. Then one Friday night, I came home later than usual. I had gone out with co-workers after work. It was around 11 p.m. when I pulled into the parking lot. As I parked, I noticed something. A car sitting near the far end of the lot. The lights were off. The engine wasn't running. At first, I didn't think anything of it. People sat in their cars all the time. But as I walked toward my apartment, I noticed something. The car wasn't facing a parking spot. It was facing my building. I stopped walking. I looked at it for a few seconds. I couldn't see inside because the windows were tinted. I considered walking over. Then I decided against it. I went inside and locked my door. About an hour later, I heard my phone vibrate. It was a notification. A message from an unknown number. I stared at it. I had no idea how someone had my phone number. The message said, "Glad you made it home safe." My stomach dropped because I hadn't told anyone I was coming home. I hadn't posted anything. I hadn't messaged anyone. The only person who knew where I was whoever had been sitting in that car. I immediately looked out my window. The parking lot was empty. The car was gone. I stood there in the dark, staring outside. And for the first time since this started, I stopped wondering if I was imagining things. Someone was watching me. The only question was, how long had they been doing it? The first note looked harmless. That was the part that bothered me the most later. Because when I found it, I didn't feel scared. I didn't feel threatened. I actually thought it was kind of funny. I remember walking out of my apartment one morning, coffee in hand, already thinking about how badly I wanted the weekend to arrive. It was a normal Tuesday. I had parked my car in the same spot I always did, near the back of the apartment parking lot. The building wasn't anything special. It was a small complex with maybe 40 units, mostly young professionals and older couples. It wasn't the kind of place where people really interacted with each other. Everyone mostly kept to themselves. You would see the same faces occasionally, but nobody really knew anyone. I had lived there for almost a year at that point, and I liked it because of that. I like being anonymous. I like coming home and not having to talk to anyone. That morning, when I reached my car, I noticed a small piece of paper tucked underneath my windshield wiper. At first, I assumed it was an advertisement. That happens sometimes. Restaurants nearby would leave flyers on cars. I almost threw it away without reading it, but something made me stop. The paper wasn't printed. It was handwritten. It simply said, "Your headlights were left on yesterday. Hope you didn't get stuck." I stared at it for a few seconds. Then I laughed. I didn't even remember leaving my headlights on, but it was possible. Maybe someone in the apartment complex noticed. Maybe they were just trying to help. It was actually a nice gesture. I folded the note and put it in my car. I didn't think about it again. A few days later, there was another one. This time it said, "You always park in the same spot." That one felt slightly different. Not scary, just strange. I remember looking around the parking lot after reading it. There were only a few people outside. A man walking his dog. Someone loading groceries into their car. Nothing unusual. I convinced myself it was probably just someone making a harmless observation. Maybe one of my neighbors was joking. Maybe someone had a weird sense of humor. I threw the note away. But after that, they kept appearing. Not every day, just enough to make me notice. One note said, "You should lock your doors." Another said, "Your back tire looks low." Another simply said, "Bad day." The weird thing was that the notes weren't threatening. If anything, they sounded concerned, almost friendly, and that made it harder to decide how I should feel. Because if someone wrote something aggressive, I would immediately know something was wrong. But these notes were different. They made me question myself. Was I overreacting? Was someone just being kind? Or was someone paying way too much attention to me? The first time I became genuinely uncomfortable was when I realized they knew things they shouldn't. I had a habit of going to the gym after work, usually around 6 p.m. I didn't tell people about it. It wasn't something I posted online. It was just part of my routine. One evening, I came out to my car and found a note. It said, "Didn't see you at the gym today." I froze. I read it 3 times. Because suddenly the situation changed. Someone wasn't just noticing my car. Someone was noticing me. I immediately looked around the parking lot. Nothing. No one standing nearby. No one watching. Just parked cars and apartment buildings. I took the note inside and locked my door. That night, I kept thinking about it. The obvious question was, who was watching me? The next morning, I reported it to the apartment manager. I didn't make it sound dramatic. I just explained that someone had been leaving strange notes on my car and that I was starting to feel uncomfortable. The manager listened, and she asked me something that I still think about. "Are you sure it's someone from the building?" I asked why she thought that. She told me something I didn't know. The parking lot wasn't completely private. There was a walking path behind the building that connected to a nearby neighborhood. Technically, anyone could walk through. That answer didn't make me feel better. It made me feel worse, because now I realized it might not even be a neighbor. It could be anyone. For the next week, nothing happened. No notes. No strange messages. Nothing. Part of me felt relieved. I started thinking maybe whoever it was had realized they were making me uncomfortable. Maybe it was over. Then one Friday night, I came home later than usual. I had gone out with co-workers after work. It was around 11 p.m. when I pulled into the parking lot. As I parked, I noticed something. A car sitting near the far end of the lot. The lights were off. The engine wasn't running. At first, I didn't think anything of it. People sat in their cars all the time. But as I walked toward my apartment, I noticed something. The car wasn't facing a parking spot. It was facing my building. I stopped walking. I looked at it for a few seconds. I couldn't see inside because the windows were tinted. I considered walking over. Then I decided against it. I went inside and locked my door. About an hour later, I heard my phone vibrate. It was a notification, a message from an unknown number. I stared at it. I had no idea how someone had my phone number. The message said, "Glad you made it home safe." My stomach dropped because I hadn't told anyone I was coming home. I hadn't posted anything. I hadn't messaged anyone. The only person who knew where I was whoever had been sitting in that car. I immediately looked out my window. The parking lot was empty. The car was gone. I stood there in the dark, staring outside. And for the first time since this started, I stopped wondering if I was imagining things. Someone was watching me. The only question was, how long had they been doing it?